When a police officer handcuffed him in a supermarket, 28-year-old Jalen Thompson realized it wasn't about shoplifting. It was about the color of his skin. But she did not know that he was a lawyer ready to destroy her career in court. The intense fight for justice begins. The humid St. Louis evening wrapped around Jalen Thompson like a heavy coat as he stepped into the brightly lit supermarket. At 28, he was a sharp-minded attorney with a steady demeanor, fresh off a courtroom win that morning. All he wanted was a coffee and a protein bar, something quick before heading home to unwind. The store was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint beep of the self-checkout scanner. Jalen swiped his card, bagged his items, and turned toward the exit. That's when he felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, like someone's eyes were boring into him. "Stop right there." The voice cut through the stillness, sharp and commanding. Jalen froze, turning slowly to face Officer Rachel Cook, a 42-year-old veteran cop with a weathered face and a stare that could slice through steel. Her hand rested lightly on the holster at her hip, her posture radiating authority. The store's few patrons, a teenage cashier and an older woman browsing the aisles, snapped their heads toward the scene. "What's the problem?" Jalen asked, keeping his tone even. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone else she might be addressing. But no, her eyes were locked on him. "I saw you slip something into your pocket after scanning," she said, her voice flat but edged with accusation. "Show me your receipt." Jalen's brow furrowed. He shifted the plastic bag to his left hand and reached inside, pulling out the crumpled slip of paper. "Here, I paid for everything." His movements were deliberate, calm. He knew better than to give her any excuse to escalate. Rachel snatched the receipt, barely glancing at it before tossing it back at him. "Empty your pockets. Now." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her certainty unshaken. "There's nothing in my pockets," Jalen replied, his voice steady but firm. He could feel the weight of the moment settling in, the familiar, sinking realization that this wasn't about evidence. Not really. He'd seen it before, in the stories of clients, in the news, in the quiet conversations at family dinners. It was about the way he looked to her, young, black, a target. "Hands on the counter," she barked, her patience snapping like a brittle twig. Jalen's jaw tightened. He could hear the cashier, a lanky kid named Mike, shifting nervously behind a register. The older woman in the aisle peeked over a shelf, her phone already in hand, recording or texting. He couldn't tell. "I didn't take anything," Jalen said, meeting her gaze. "Check the cameras if you don't believe me." Rachel's hand dropped to her radio, her eyes narrowing. "Dispatch, I've had a possible shoplifting suspect refusing to comply." Her words were clipped, rehearsed, like she'd said them 100 times before. "Refusing to comply?" Jalen repeated, a flicker of frustration breaking through his calm. He kept his hands visible, his stance non-threatening, but inside his pulse quickened. He knew how this script played out, how non-compliance could twist into whatever she wanted it to mean. Mike, the cashier, took a hesitant step forward. Ma'am? I saw him pay." "He didn't. Stay out of it." Rachel snapped, not even turning her head. The kid shrank back, his courage evaporating under a glare. Jalen exhaled slowly through his nose. He could feel the eyes of the onlookers, the silent judgment, the assumption that he must have done something wrong. But he wasn't just some guy caught off guard. He was an attorney. He knew his rights, knew the law better than she ever would. And he knew one thing for certain. Officer Rachel Cook had just picked the wrong man to mess with. She stepped closer, her boots thudding against the linoleum floor. "Last chance. Empty your pockets, or we're doing this the hard way." Jalen held her stare for a long moment, weighing his options. He could argue, demand a supervisor, call her bluff, but he'd seen enough cases to know that wouldn't end well. Not here, not now. So he nodded, just once, and raised his hand slightly. "Fine. Do what you've already decided to do." Her lips curled into a faint, triumphant smirk as she reached for his wrist. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut, sending a jolt through his body. The sound echoed in the quiet store, a stark punctuation to her victory, or so she thought. As she gripped his arm and steered him toward the exit, Jalen caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass door. A man in cuffs, but not defeated. Not yet. Rachel didn't know it, but she just lit the fuse on a fight she couldn't win. Jalen Thompson wasn't going down quietly. He'd take this to court, tear her story apart, and make sure she regretted ever crossing his path. This wasn't just about a false accusation anymore. It was about justice, and he was ready to claim it. The cuffs bit into Jalen Thompson's wrists as Officer Rachel Cook marched him out of the supermarket, her grip firm and unyielding. The St. Louis night air hit him like a slap. Humid, thick, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the store. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, their phones out, capturing every second of the spectacle. Jalen kept his head high, his expression blank, but inside his mind was racing. He could hear the whispers. What did he do? Probably stole something. Each word a dagger, twisting deeper. Rachel didn't care about the truth. She'd already written her story, and he was the villain. Watch your step, she muttered, shoving him toward the squad car parked crookedly in the lot. The red and blue lights flashed silently, painting the scene in an eerie glow. Jalen slid into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in his chest. Through the window, he caught Mike, the cashier, staring wide-eyed from the store's doorway, his hands stuffed in his apron pockets. The kid looked like he wanted to say something, but fear, or maybe apathy, kept him rooted in place. Rachel climbed into the driver's seat, her movements brisk, confident. She adjusted the rearview mirror, her eyes meeting Jalen's for a fleeting second. There was no doubt in her gaze, no hesitation, just the smug certainty of someone who'd done this too many times to count. The radio crackled to life as she pulled out of the lot. Unit 17, en route to the station with a shoplifting suspect. Male, mid-20s, detained without incident. Jalen's jaw clenched. Without incident? He'd stood still, hands visible, voice calm. Yet here he was, labeled a threat. The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional burst of static from the radio. Jalen stared out at the city blurring past. Neon signs, brick row houses, people living their lives unaware of the quiet war unfolding in this car. He didn't speak. Anything he said now would be twisted, filed away as aggression or resistance. He'd seen it in case files, heard it from clients. The system didn't care about innocence until you forced it to. So he waited, plotting each move like a chess game. Rachel thought she held all the pieces, but Jalen knew the board better than she ever would. When they reached the precinct, she yanked the door open with a flourish, like a hunter displaying her catch. Out, she ordered. Jalen stepped onto the pavement, his movements measured, deliberate. Inside, the station buzzed with low energy, officers shuffling papers, a drunk guy muttering in a holding cell. Rachel steered him past the front desk, tossing his wallet and keys onto the counter. Shoplifting, she said casually to the desk sergeant, a grizzled man with bags under his eyes. Caught him red-handed. The sergeant barely looked up. Serious? He asked, his tone dry, almost bored. Had to cuff him, Rachel replied, shrugging. Got hostile when I asked for his receipt. Jalen's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his mouth shut. Hostile? He'd handed her the receipt, stayed calm even as she ignored it. That word, hostile, carried weight here, a code that shifted the narrative before he could even defend himself. The sergeant grunted, flipping through Jalen's wallet. He paused, pulling out a slim card with a gold embossing. Missouri Bar Association. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You're a lawyer? He asked, glancing at Jalen. Yes, sir, Jalen replied, his voice low but steady. Rachel snorted, folding her arms. Sure he is. Probably bought that off eBay. The sergeant's eyes flicked to her, then back to the card. He turned it over, inspecting the details before handing it to a younger officer hovering nearby. Ethan, according to his name tag. Ethan, maybe 25, with a nervous energy, studied the card, then Jalen. He's legit, Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. He looked at Rachel, hesitating. You sure about this charge? He stole from a store? She snapped, her tone sharpening. I saw it. Ethan frowned, glancing at Jalen again. Sir, you got a lawyer? Jalen met his gaze, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Don't need one. I'll handle it myself. Rachel rolled her eyes, but Ethan's expression shifted, curiosity, maybe even respect. All right, he muttered, handing Jalen's wallet back. Get him processed. Rachel grabbed Jalen's arm again, leading him down a dimly lit hallway lined with holding cells. The air smelled of bleach and stale coffee. She shoved him toward a bench. Seat. You'll be arraigned tomorrow. Her voice dripped with satisfaction, like she'd already won. She turned on her heel and strode off, her boots echoing in the concrete corridor. Jalen sank onto the bench, the cold metal seeping through his jeans. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the flickering light overhead. They'd hold him overnight, maybe longer, standard procedure to wear people down, push them into a plea. But Jalen wasn't most people. He closed his eyes, replaying every second of the arrest. Her accusations, the ignored receipt, the cashier's timid defense. He had the law on his side, and soon he'd have her badge in his crosshairs. Rachel thought she'd humiliated him, broken him down. She had no idea she'd just handed him the ammunition to dismantle her career. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, he'd turn her victory into ash. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing her, the system she thrived in, and every lie she'd built her authority on. Jalen Thompson was ready to fight, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The St. Louis courtroom was a cavern of polished wood and muted light, the air thick with the weight of judgment. Jalen Thompson sat at the defense table, his borrowed suit jacket crisp despite a sleepless night in a holding cell. At 28, he'd argued cases here before, but never as the defendant. His hands rested calmly on the table, though the faint ache of the cuffs lingered in his wrists. Across the room, Officer Rachel Cook stood beside the prosecution, her uniform pristine, her posture radiating confidence. To her, this was routine, a quick conviction, another notch on her belt. She hadn't even glanced at the docket. The judge, a wiry woman in her 60s named Margaret Hale, peered over her glasses, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Let's get started. Charges. The prosecutor, a slick 30-something named Greg Larson, stood with a practiced grin. Your Honor, the defendant, Jalen Thompson, is charged with shoplifting. Officer Cook witnessed him stealing from a supermarket and detained him after he resisted compliance. Jalen shook his head slightly, a quiet breath escaping his nose. The lies flowed so easily. Judge Hale turned to him. Mr. Thompson, do you have counsel? Jalen rose, buttoning his jacket with steady hands. I do, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself. A ripple of murmurs spread through the sparse audience. Reporters, a few curious locals, and Ethan, the young officer from the precinct, perched in the back. Larson's grin faltered, but Rachel didn't flinch, her arms crossed like she was already bored. Hale nodded. Very well. How do you plead? Not guilty, Jalen said, his voice clear, unwavering. Let's hear the officer's testimony, Hale directed. Rachel stepped forward, her tone clipped and authoritative. Your Honor, I was on patrol when I entered the supermarket and observed the defendant pocket an item after scanning only part of his purchase. I asked for his receipt, which he failed to produce adequately. He became argumentative, refused to cooperate, and resisted when I detained him. Jalen tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Sloppy. He'd heard worse lies, but not by much. Hale nodded. Mr. Thompson, you may cross-examine. He stood, adjusting his tie with a slow, deliberate motion. Officer Cook, you claim you saw me pocket an item without paying. Correct? Yes, she replied, her chin lifting slightly. And I didn't produce a receipt? That's right. Jalen paced a step, hands clasped behind his back. Were there security cameras in the store? Rachel hesitated, just a heartbeat, but he caught it. Yes, but the footage hasn't been reviewed yet. He turned to Larson. Did your office request it? Larson shifted in his seat. It wasn't deemed necessary at this stage. Jalen let that hang in the air, then faced Rachel again. You said I was argumentative and resisted. How? You refuse to empty your pockets and raise your voice, she said, her tone hardening. Raise my voice, Jalen echoed, nodding. Interesting. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit I, my purchase receipt, which I had at the time of arrest. He handed the folded slip to the bailiff, who passed it to Hale. She examined it, her brows lifting. This shows Mr. Thompson paid for all listed items. Officer Cook, did you review this receipt? Rachel's posture stiffened. I must have overlooked it. Overlooked it, Jalen repeated, his voice even but cutting. He let the silence stretch, then continued. No body cam footage, correct? You mentioned it malfunctioned. Yes, she said, her jaw tightening. Hale's eyes narrowed. That wasn't in your report. Jalen folded his arms. So, no security footage reviewed, no body cam, and a receipt proving I paid. Ignored. Tell me, Officer Cook, were you certain I stole, or did you just assume I fit the profile? A gasp rippled through the room. Rachel's face flushed, her hands balling into fists. That's not what happened, she snapped. Then what did? Jalen pressed. Because right now, it looks like you saw a black man in a store and decided that was enough. Objection. Larson shot up. Speculative. Overruled. Hale said, her gaze fixed on Rachel. Answer the question. Rachel's lips parted, but no sound came. Jalen didn't relent. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B, video testimony from the cashier, Mike Reynolds, who saw everything. Larson leapt again. Objection. This wasn't disclosed. Overruled. Hale cut in. Play it. The bailiff cued the footage on a screen. Mike, nervous and fidgeting, appeared. I saw him pay at self-checkout. The officer walked in, looked at him, and went straight over. She didn't check the cameras or ask me anything. Just assumed. The room went still. Jalen turned to Rachel. Did you ask Mike what he saw? I didn't need to, she said, her voice tight. Didn't need to, Jalen echoed, stepping closer. Or didn't want to, because the moment you saw me, you'd already made up your mind. Rachel's temple pulsed, but she stayed silent. Jalen faced Hale. Your Honor, I request a review of Officer Cook's past arrest records. If there's a pattern of bias, it undermines her credibility here. Larson objected, but Hale waved him off. Granted. Pull the files. The bailiff tapped at a laptop, and a list flashed on screen. 3 complaints of racial profiling in 2 years. Jalen's voice was calm, but lethal. How many of those involved black men, Officer Cook? Her face paled. The room held its breath. This wasn't just a defense anymore. It was an unraveling, and Rachel Cook was teetering on the edge. The St. Louis courtroom pulsed with tension, the air crackling as Jalen Thompson stood poised at the defense table. The screen still glowed with Officer Rachel Cook's record. 3 racial profiling complaints in 2 years, each a glaring mark against her credibility. Rachel remained rigid, her uniform a shield she clung to, but her hands twitched at her sides. She'd walked in expecting a slam-dunk case. Now, the floor was slipping out from under her. Jalen's voice cut through the silence, steady and unrelenting. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. I paid for my items. Here's the receipt. The cashier saw it. Here's his testimony. The cameras would have shown it, but Officer Cook didn't bother to check. No body cam, no review, just her word, tainted by a history of bias. He paused, letting the weight settle. I was falsely arrested, targeted not for what I did, but for who I am. I moved to dismiss this case immediately. Judge Margaret Hale leaned forward, her glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. The prosecutor, Greg Larson, slumped in his chair, rubbing his temples as if he could erase the last hour. Rachel's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Hale's voice rang out, firm and final. Motion granted. Case dismissed. A murmur swept through the room. Relief from the back, where Ethan sat watching, and a rustle from the reporters scribbling furiously. Jalen exhaled, his shoulders easing, but he wasn't done. The gavel's echo hadn't faded when Hale spoke again. Officer Cook, a word before we adjourn. Rachel snapped to attention, her face a mask of forced composure. Yes, Your Honor. Hale removed her glasses, her gaze piercing. This court doesn't take misconduct lightly. Mr. Thompson's evidence raises serious questions, not just about this arrest, but your pattern of behavior. I'm recommending an immediate internal investigation into your actions, past and present." Rachel's composure cracked, color draining from her cheeks. "Your Honor, that's not necessary." "Not your call." Hale interrupted. Her tone brooked no argument. "The department will decide your fate. Bailiff, ensure this recommendation reaches the proper channels." Rachel swallowed hard, her fists tightening. Jalen stepped forward, his voice low but resonant. "Officer Cook, you were so sure I was guilty, you didn't check a single fact. You saw me, a black man, and that was enough. I could have lost everything. My job, my reputation, my freedom. But I had the tools to fight back." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "What about the people who don't?" Her lips parted, but no words came. The question hung heavy, unanswered. The courtroom door swung open, and a man in a dark suit, Captain Ruiz, a police department official, strode in. He whispered to the bailiff, who nodded and approached Hale. After a brief exchange, Hale turned back. "Officer Cook, effective immediately. You're on administrative leave pending investigation." Rachel's face twisted, shock morphing into disbelief. "This isn't fair," she blurted, her voice raw. Jalen's gaze didn't waver. "Neither was cuffing me for no reason." The silence was deafening. Two officers stepped forward, flanking Rachel as she was escorted out. Her boots dragged against the floor, her head bowed, the weight of her actions crashing down. Jalen watched her go, then gathered his things, running a hand over his briefcase. This wasn't just his win. It was a crack in a system that shielded people like her far too long. As he turned to leave, a reporter intercepted him. Mike thrust forward. "Mr. Thompson, what's next after this victory?" Jalen paused, the question sparking something in him. "I'm starting a legal defense fund," he said, his voice firm. "For people who can't fight false arrests alone. No one should go through this because of bias or bad cops." The reporter nodded, scribbling, but Jalen's mind was already racing ahead. He stepped into the hallway, the buzz of the courthouse fading as he pulled out his phone. His sister, Layla, answered on the second ring. "Jalen, you okay?" "Yeah," he said, a faint smile breaking through. "Just one. Case dismissed, and she's off the force for now." Layla let out a whoop. "I knew you'd crush it. Mom's been pacing all morning." "Tell her I'm fine," he said, leaning against the wall. "And I've got an idea. A fund to help others like me. Legal support, resources, something real." She went quiet, then softened. "That's big, Jalen." "You sure?" "Never been surer," he replied. "This isn't just about me anymore." Layla laughed, pride in her voice. "Then do it. You've got this." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, staring out at the city through a window. Rachel Cook's career was crumbling, her badge tarnished by her own arrogance. But Jalen's fight was just beginning. He'd exposed her, forced the system to blink, and now he'd make sure the next person in cuffs had a chance to win too. The reckoning wasn't over, it was spreading. Jalen Thompson stepped out of the St. Louis courthouse into the midday sun, the warmth cutting through the weight of the past 24 hours. At 28, he'd walked in as a defendant, falsely accused of shoplifting by Officer Rachel Cook. Now, he emerged victorious. Case dismissed, her career in ruins, and a fire lit inside him. The crowd outside buzzed, reporters snapping photos, locals whispering, but Jalen barely noticed. He inhaled deeply, the air tasting of freedom and something more, possibility. This wasn't just his win, it was a spark for something bigger. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Layla's voice burst through when he answered. "Jalen, Mom's crying. Says she knew you'd pull through. You're all over the news. Lawyer beats false arrest, takes down cop." Jalen chuckled, leaning against the courthouse steps. "Good tears, I hope. Tell her I'm okay. Better than okay." "She's proud," Layla said, her tone softening. "We all are. That fund idea, helping people fight back, you mean it?" "Dead serious," he replied, his eyes tracing the skyline. "Too many don't get a shot like I did. That changes now." "You're going to shake things up," she said, a grin in her voice. "Just don't forget to sleep, okay?" "Deal," he said, hanging up as a shadow fell across him. He looked up to see Ethan, the young officer from the precinct, jogging over, his uniform slightly rumpled. "Mr. Thompson," Ethan said, catching his breath. "What you did in there? I've never seen anything like it. Turning the tables like that, taking her down with facts. It was unreal." Jalen raised an eyebrow, studying him. "You see stuff like that often, don't you? False arrests, people stuck because they can't fight." Ethan shifted, scratching his neck. "Yeah, more than I'd like. Usually they just take the plea. No one's got your kind of ammo. You ever call it out?" Jalen asked, his tone calm but pointed. Ethan's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping. "It's not that simple. Chain of command, politics, you know how it goes." "I do," Jalen said, stepping closer. "I also know it's not simple to prove your innocence from a jail cell. Took everything I had to flip this. Most don't get that chance." Ethan nodded slowly, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I wanted to say something last night. When she brought you in, I knew something was off. Should have pushed harder." Jalen let the words sit, then shrugged. "You saw the truth before she did. That's a start. Question is, what do you do next?" Ethan glanced back at the courthouse, then at Jalen. "She's not the only one like that on the force. But not all of us are, either. I want to be different." "Then be," Jalen said, his voice firm. "It starts with one person. Not looking away, not staying quiet. Prove it." Ethan gave a small, resolute nod. "I will." He turned and walked off, disappearing into the crowd, his shoulders a little straighter. Jalen watched him go, then pulled out his phone again, scrolling to a contact, Marcus Reed, an old law school buddy who'd gone into civil rights work. The line clicked. "Jalen, man, saw you on TV. You're a legend now." "Not yet," Jalen said, smiling. "Need your help. I'm starting a fund. Legal aid for people hit with false charges, profiling, whatever. You in?" Marcus laughed. "Hell yeah. Been waiting for you to go big. Where do we start?" "Meeting next week," Jalen said. "Bring your brain. I've got the fire." "Done," Marcus said. "This is going to change lives, bro." Jalen hung up, slipping the phone into his pocket as he descended the steps. The city stretched out before him, busy, messy, flawed. Rachel Cook's downfall was a win, but it wasn't the end. She'd been suspended, her badge on the line, her arrogance exposed for all to see. The system had blinked, forced to reckon with her actions. But Jalen knew it wouldn't fix itself overnight. There were too many others, people cuffed for no reason, voices silenced by a machine that didn't care. That's where he came in. He paused at the bottom of the steps, the idea crystallizing. The Jalen Thompson Defense Fund. Free legal support, education, a lifeline for the next person dragged into a squad car over nothing. He'd build it brick by brick, court wins, donations, allies like Marcus, and maybe even Ethan. It wouldn't erase the past, but it could damn well shape the future. A kid on a skateboard rolled by, glancing at Jalen with a nod, like he knew something big had happened. Jalen nodded back, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. Yesterday, he'd been a name on a docket, a target of bias. Today, he was a force, someone who'd beaten the odds and turned the tables. Tomorrow, he'd be a shield for others. He started walking, the sun high overhead, casting his shadow long and sharp. Rachel Cook had lost everything, her credibility, her power, because she'd underestimated him. But Jalen? He was just getting started. One victory wouldn't change the world, but it could start a ripple. And that ripple would grow, case by case, life by life, until no one had to fight alone. That was his promise, and he'd keep it.